On Lebanon now, there are violations of the ceasefire from Israel and Hezbollah. Are you aware of that, and what's your assessment of the ceasefire?
So let me say this about the ceasefire that went into place last week after fairly intense couple months of diplomatic work by the United States, led principally by the President's special envoy, by Amos Hochstein, but engaged really by people throughout the government to get over the finish line. So what we have seen since the ceasefire went into effect is it being successful. Broadly speaking, it has been successful in stopping the fighting and getting us on a path where we are not seeing the just daily loss of life that we had seen for 2 months prior. Now, with respect to violations or potential violations of the ceasefire, we set a mechanism up to look into this very question, where the United States, along with France, will engage with the Israeli military, will engage with the Lebanese military to look at potential violations. We obviously anticipated that there might be violations because anytime, or nearly any time, you have a ceasefire of this nature, you have either claimed violations of the ceasefire, especially in the opening weeks when things are very fragile, or you have real violations of a ceasefire. So what we are doing is engaging through this mechanism to look at all of these reports of violations of the ceasefire and deal with them through the channels that the mechanism set up, and that's what we'll do over the coming days.
And a couple of ones too, if you don't mind. Speaker Berry has set January 9th as a date for the Lebanese parliament to elect a new president. Was that part of the ceasefire agreement that the U.S. brokered?
It was not a part of the ceasefire agreement, but we have always made clear to the government of Lebanon, to political actors in Lebanon, that we wanted to see a president elected by the parliament as soon as possible. As you know, because you and I have talked about it many times in this room, we have been pushing for the election of a new president for several years now, dating back well before October 7th, dating well back before the intensification of conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in September of this year. And we continue to push for the election of a new president because we think it's important to strengthening Lebanese political institutions.
My last one, does the U.S. still support the LAF commander, Joseph Aoun, to be the next president, as Axios has reported?
We are not, sorry, did not mean to cut you off. We are not taking sides in that election. We have been quite clear from day one. You have heard us say this publicly, and I can tell you, sitting in a number of these meetings, that we have been consistent privately as well, that it is up to Lebanon to choose its next president. It is not up to the United States. It is not up to any external actor. It is up to Lebanese political actors to determine who the president will be.
When you said that it's broadly speaking successful, the ceasefire is holding, basically, in your view, despite what you see.
Look, the ceasefire is holding. Now, look, obviously, when you have any ceasefire, you can see violations of it, and that's why we set up this mechanism in the first place, because we knew that there would be potential violations. Just as anywhere in the world, when you see a ceasefire implemented, you see various violations at times. Ultimately, what we don't want to see is the ceasefire breakdown, and we've not seen the ceasefire breakdown. When we get reports of potential violations, we have a mechanism that we put in place with the government of France to look at those potential violations, determine if they are in fact violations, and then engage with the parties to ensure that they aren't repeated.
Have you determined whether there are violations, that there have been violations over the past
This
days?
is work that's ongoing through the mechanism. I think it's appropriate for me to let that mechanism do its work privately and speak to the parties before I talk about the results of that work from the podium here. And I should add, it's not just that's also the case because this is not just it's not just the U.S. that is a participant in this mechanism. The government of France is as well. So we need to engage with our partners about these reports
that
of violations.
almost raised violations with the Israeli government. Can you say whether those were adjudicated or just concerns of potential violations?
I'm not going to speak to those reports other than what I've already said, which is we take all of them very seriously, and we work through the mechanism that we set up to adjudicate them. And ultimately, if we do see violations of the ceasefire, we'll go to the parties and tell them to knock it off. We want to see the ceasefire hold. We want to see it be successful. We want to see people be able to return to their homes in southern Lebanon and northern Israel.
Under the terms of the agreement, does the U.S. believe Israel has the right to take kinetic military action if they themselves deem something to have been a violation or a potential threat? Do they have the right to then militarily launch any sort of operation into Lebanon?
So, first of all, there's a mechanism, and I think it is. Before I get to the broader answer, it's important that the mechanism be allowed to work and determine what are violations and what are not. But every country, both Israel, every country, that includes Israel and includes Lebanon as well, has the inherent right to self-defense under international law. That was a fact before the implementation of this ceasefire agreement. It remains a fact that all countries have the right to self-defense under international law.
Well, the reason I asked, Matt, is there are reports coming out of Israel now that the Israelis have informed the U.S. that they intend to strike Lebanon in response to the Hezbollah projectiles that were fired earlier today. Does that fit within the confines of the agreement?
I am not going to speak to reports of possible action, hypothetical action, and try to litigate from here whether those would violate the ceasefire agreement or not. We're going to have those conversations privately. We have channels set up to do that, and we will hold those conversations not in public, but
Last
private.
question: is that a real-time channel? Like, could they?
Yeah, the mechanism is already up and engaging. We're putting more steps in place to formalize it over the coming days, but it is already up and working.
And that mechanism would allow either side to immediately, in real time, call in potential violations?
It allows
Is there any
it allows both sides to report potential violations of the ceasefire, and allows us and our French partners to engage with them as well.
Ma'am, can I go to
Yeah,
that?
Hiba, go ahead.
Yes. So what's the difference then between now and after 2006? If what you are asking the parties to report to you instead of stopping what's happening, it's just we will have another round. Since the ceasefire was brokered, we saw multiple violations. And today now, Hezbollah, 1 hour ago, he said that he's responding to the Israeli that because of what he called violations. So what's the difference now? Are we going back to October 6th?
Let me just say, Hiba, that I don't think it is a little too early to make predictions about what's going to happen going forward. We are less than a week into the implementation of this ceasefire. In just about every ceasefire in a major conflict around the world, those early days are when it is most fragile and when you are most likely to see violations and risk of violations. And what it is our job to do, along with the government of France, along with other countries, is to engage in the process that we have set up to impress upon both Lebanon and Israel that it is in their interest that this ceasefire hold. And it is in their interest that this ceasefire be fully implemented. Because remember, we are at the early stages in a process that calls for, over the next probably 55, 54 days now, where Israel will fully withdraw all of its troops, something that hasn't happened yet because we aren't yet at that stage of the ceasefire. For that to work, we have to see a continued broad holding of the ceasefire. We need to see the mechanism work work through its procedures to make sure violations are reported and dealt with as they should be, and that is an important difference from the ceasefire in 2006. And then we need to see Lebanese forces deploy to south of the Litani River in a meaningful way. Also a difference between the ceasefire that was brokered in 2006. So those are the meaningful differences to answer your question. But we are less than a week into this. I think it's a little too early to make judgments about what the future is going to look like. Let me.
Okay, go ahead. Syria, go ahead. I wanted to go to Gaza.
You want?
Okay.
It's.
Two quick questions.
I'll let the room work it out. I'm here to take your questions.
You want to go on Syria?
I'm okay
Okay.
with that.
All right. First, a pause for interrupting to you and to Hiba.
Don't worry about it, Saeed.
Okay. The former Israeli defense minister says that Israel is carrying ethnic cleansing in northern Gaza. Moshe Ayalon, a very, stalwart Likudnik, and so on. So why is that offensive to you? Why can't you say what Israel is doing is basically ethnic cleansing?
So we have engaged with the government of Israel about its actions in northern Gaza. I think those statements refer broadly to the so-called general's plan. I can tell you two things. Number one, they have said to us that's not their policy. And number two, we have made clear to them that we would fundamentally reject any such policy. I can't speak to the assessments made by a former Israeli military official. I can tell you that when it comes to potential violations of international humanitarian law, something else he raised in his statement, we have our ongoing assessments, and they have not concluded.
But most observers see what's going on, and they term it as such. They I know you disapprove the word genocide and so on, but a lot of people think what's going on is genocide, especially that the threshold has crossed 45,000 people. So I'm saying that at one point, the U.S. has to recognize what's going on for what it is, right? For what it is. Say, that, when you move about 2 million people, that is some sort of ethnic cleansing. Do you disagree?
So we have been very clear what we want to see happen in Gaza, and that's everyone who has been forced from their homes, we want to see have the opportunity to go back to their neighborhoods and have the ability to rebuild and have support from the international community to rebuild. And we continue to engage, not just with the government of Israel, but with other countries in the region to work to get both a ceasefire and the release of hostages and a plan for the day after that would ultimately allow those Palestinians who have been displaced to do that.
But there seems to be no plan for the day after as far as Israel is concerned. We have not seen it. We have not seen it in statement or in deeds and so on. In fact, yesterday, or the day before, I don't remember, they killed three other workers from the World Central Kitchen, so that Israel shows its intent to deprive Gaza of any kind of aid that goes, under the pretext that they are attacking a militant. I mean, they've killed the people that committed October 7th. There were maybe 1,400. They have killed already 45,000 people, and they keep doing this under the guise or the pretext or the claim that there was a militant among those people.
So, with respect to that strike, I can't speak to it. I know that they have made the public claim that one of the people killed in that strike was affiliated with the attacks on October 7th, or had been involved in the attacks of October 7th. If that's true, it would, of course, be extremely troubling. But that said, there were other civilians who died in that strikes, which is why we continue to push for a ceasefire. I can tell you that the Secretary is meeting with Israel's Minister for Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, later today here at the State Department, where he is going to continue to express the position of the United States that we need to get a ceasefire, we need to see the hostages released, we need to implement plans for the day after that would allow or would establish governance, security, and reconstruction inside Gaza, and that ought to be an urgent priority, not just for the United States, not just for other countries in the region, but for Israel as well.
Would you demand to look at the evidence that Israel claims to have used in killing the kitchen, central kitchen, the World Central Kitchen? It's a Washington-based organization.
Look, we think that barring any unique intelligence sensitivities, that's evidence that they ought to make public for the world to see.
And you think they will?
No, I'm not going to make any predictions about the future.
Thank you.